Hello and welcome to episode number 10 of Maverick Mastery. This week, we will be solving a few questions on critical reasoning. There will be 5 questions that I go through. I try to explain to the best of my ability what is present in those questions and how he's thinking about solving them. And then there will be 5 questions that I give you for practice. The answers to those 5 questions will be present in the description below this video. Hopefully, it is a learning experience for you. Let's start with the first question that we have to work. Now, the audience is a very curious animal. It is shrewd rather than intelligent. Okay. So this time the author has distinguished between the ability to be shrewd and the ability to be intelligent, or between shrewdness and intelligence. Its mental capacity, the audience's mental capacity, is less than that of its most intellectual members. Which is to say, if we were to look at the entire group, their mental capacity is less than some of its more enlightened members, some of its more intellectual members. If these were graded from A to Z, the mental capacity of individuals were graded from A to Z, decreasing with succeeding letters to 0 of the hysterical shock curve. So the most intelligent person, and it keeps on decreasing to the 0 mental capacity of the hysterical shock curve. I would say its mental capacity would come around about the letter O. Okay. So the average, if I were to put it down in the range, the average would be around O. The average would be around O. Look at the O. O is the 16th letter, the entire English alphabet. O is the 16th letter. Out of 26 letters, O is the 16th letter. Okay. According to the above passage, which of the following is true? Some members in the audience are more intelligent than any of its other members. Yes, there are going to be certain more intelligent people. There are going to be certain comparatively lesser intelligent. Although the statement about intelligence is very, very misleading. In intelligence, you cannot really claim X person is more intelligent than Y. You can claim X person is more intelligent than Y when it comes to work Z. Because intelligence is of various types, and in different contexts. In one context, X may be more intelligent than Y. In another context, Y may be more intelligent than X. So, making a categorical remark about intelligence. This is not in reference to this question. It is more to do with general world order. One person being more intelligent than the other as a categorical statement is always flawed. Okay. Anyway, within the reference of this question, some members in the audience are more intelligent than any of its other members. This is valid. The problem with this is, if A is valid, option C would also be valid, which means both of these are not necessarily the answer. Both of these are not necessarily, A and C are not the answer. Logically, see, A and C are not the answer. Now, see, while this is valid, A cannot be the answer, C cannot be the answer, because C says only. And now understand, if A is valid, A has to be a part of our answer. A has to be a part of our answer. So we cannot really mark only B as the answer or option B as the answer. By extension, by using critical reasoning, the answer here has to definitely be D. Because A is valid, C cannot be the answer, A cannot be the answer, because both of them point to the same thing. And because we know A is valid, it has to be a part of my answer. The only option that does encompass A and is not ruled out so far is option D. That has to be the answer. This is critical reasoning way of reaching the answer. The reason why option B is valid, let's read that. The net intelligence of the audience is a little less than average. Now see, A is the first letter and Z is the 26th letter. And if we are grading the intelligence of people, the average would be around the 13.5 letter. 13.5 because first term plus last term divided by 2. The fact that we have been given the statement, the average intelligence of the audience would be around the 16th letter O. It means the average intelligence or the net intelligence of the audience is slightly below average. Mathematically, that is being indicated. And therefore, A is also valid, B is also valid. And by extension, the correct answer to the question should be option D, both A and B. This is a CAT 1995 question. This was a question that was present in CAT. Earlier, back in late 90s and even early 2000s, there were questions directly related to CR present in the paper. Although that is not the case anymore. We have questions related to CR coming in NMAT and SNAP and XAT and other allied exams. But this question is from CAT itself. Okay, move on. Next question. The theory of games is suggested to some extent by parlor games such as chess and bridge. Friedman illustrates two distinct features of these games. First, in a parlor game played for money, if one wins, the other loses. Or if one wins, the others lose. You could have multiple losers, you could have a singular loser, but one wins, the other loses. So the first feature that has been shown is there have to be wins and losses. There have to be wins and losses. Second, these games are involving strategy. In a game of chess, by choosing what action is to be taken, a player tries to guess how his or her opponent will react to various actions he or she might take. In contrast, the card pastime, patience or solitaire is played only against chance. Okay. So, first feature is the game should have some sort of wins and losses. Second feature is there has to be some sort of prediction of how the other party will respond, not how it will randomly turn out based on chance. These are the two features that have been highlighted according to the passage. Let's go. Which of the following can be best described as a game? We would be looking for an instance. Where there is an indication of win or a loss, and there is also an indication of prediction of the other side's behavior. First one, the team of Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary climbing Mount Everest for the first time in human history. Now, you could at least classify that as a win or loss. If they do end up at the top of the Mount Everest, it would be classified as a win. If they don't, it would be classified as a loss, maybe. But at least you realize there is no prediction against the other party. This is very similar to the game of solitaire. You're playing. If the conditions work out well for you, if the skies are clear, the trail that you're following is fine, okay, you get to the top of the Mount Everest. If the skies are not clear, if there is a avalanche, if there is, let's say, some wild animal attacks you, but then these are objects of chance. You cannot really predict there is no other party for you to engage in prediction in. Therefore, A at this time is not ideal. As in, there is a problem with option A. Second option, a national war between the armed forces of India and Pakistan over Kashmir. Between A and B, clearly B is better, because when there is a war, there is a winner and a loss. And because the two armies are fighting against each other, they are engaging in a predictive battle of sorts. If we attack this way, what will their response be? How do we counter that response? All that idea will go into engaging in a war. So between A and B, B is better. Option C, a decisive war between the armed forces of India and Pakistan over Kashmir. Now see, B and C options are very, very similar, except for the second one. And this second word makes all the difference in the world. In the absence of option B is very nice. In the absence of option C, option B is very nice. But with the presence of option C, where it is explicitly mentioning the idea of wins and losses, and then the prediction mechanism is identical across both the options, preferred choice out of the two. There is nothing wrong with B. It is just that C is more correct. There is nothing wrong with C. It's just that C is more correct. It's not B, it's C. That is the reason we have to employ. And C survives. Now between C and D, Oil Exporters Union deciding on world oil prices, completely disregarding the countries which have at most minimal oil production. If we are completely disregarding the countries, we are not engaging in a prediction-based mechanism where how the other party would behave. Therefore, between C and D, the better choice that survives is option C, and that should be the answer. There's another one of those former CAT questions. This is from CAT 2000. and fairly straightforward, fairly understandable. Let us go to the third question now. First question: randomness has to be dealt with successfully to ensure a better control over one's life. Before one can deal effectively with randomness, one must acknowledge its existence. Okay? These two statements. Hopefully, we know the three kind of conditional statements that we have in critical reasoning. If A, then B, else C. Only if A, then B, and if and only if and only if A, then B. Hopefully, we know these three kinds of conditional statements that are utilized in critical reasoning or even when it comes to DILR sets. Now, the information given here, randomness has to be dealt with successfully in order to ensure a better control over one's life. So once you deal with randomness, you will have better control over one's life. If A, then B, first statement, the first version. Randomness has to be dealt with to ensure a better control over one's life. Okay. And the next is, before one can deal effectively with randomness, one must acknowledge its existence. Essentially, what we're saying is, until the time you acknowledge the existence, you cannot deal effectively with randomness. If you do not deal with existence, you cannot deal effectively with randomness, or this is a necessary prerequisite. This is a necessary prerequisite for the subsequent action to take place, which is an indication. Both of these ideas have been mentioned. And when both of these ideas are mentioned, then essentially we have got into the third version. If and only if you acknowledge the existence of randomness, you can and deal with it, then you can successfully ensure a better control over one's life. Both of these statements combined can be interpreted or can be inferred. Okay. The question finally is, the above statements imply the following except. So we are looking for something that is not implied by the statements given. Randomness can be dealt with effectively. Yes, it is implied. If I acknowledge the existence of randomness, and if I acknowledge the existence of randomness, then randomness can be dealt with effectively. So this is implied. Option B, if one acknowledges the existence of randomness, one will be able to deal with it effectively. Okay, see, if one acknowledges the existence of randomness, one will be able to deal with it effectively. This is not implied, because what we have been told is, it is simply the first step. It is a necessary prerequisite for you to be able to deal with it effectively. How do you go about dealing with it effectively? Maybe you need to have emotional intelligence. Maybe you need to have a support group around you. Just because you have acknowledged the existence of randomness, that does not translate into you will be able to deal with it effectively. So A is implied, B is not implied. A goes away, B stays. Option C. One can deal effectively with randomness if and only if one acknowledges its existence. Okay. Until the time you acknowledge the existence, unless you have fulfilled this prerequisite, you cannot really deal effectively with randomness. And that is true given from the second statement. Before one can deal effectively with randomness, one must acknowledge its existence. If one does not acknowledge its existence, you cannot deal effectively with randomness. Okay. Now see the difference between B and C. One can and one will be able to. This is saying the subsequent course of action will necessarily happen. And this is saying the subsequent course of action is possible. Therefore, between the two of them, C is inferable, C is implied, B is not implied. C goes away. Option D, everyone lives in a random world. Now, from the given statements, it is difficult to come to the implication that everyone lives in a random world. But given the generic nature of the statements, these are not very specific statements for a particular person. Given the generic nature of the statements, If a push comes to a shove and you had to choose between option B and D, if a push comes to a shove and you have to choose between option B and D, you can still stretch the argument a little to go on to make the statement, everyone lives in a random world. Randomness has to be dealt with successfully in order to ensure a better control over one's life. This is being made as a general statement. This is being made for everyone. So when this is being made for everyone, you can perhaps get the inference that everyone lives in a random world. But the fact that once you acknowledge the existence of randomness, you will be able to deal with it effectively. That is not implied. So between B and D, D is a little far-fetched, but between B and D, D is inferable, D is not. Option D. If one does not acknowledge the existence of randomness, one cannot deal with it effectively. This is simply the negation of statement C. Negation of statement C. And yes, this is true. If and only if A, then B implies if A, then B, if B dash, then A dash. If one does not acknowledge the existence of randomness, one cannot deal with it effectively. This is very much implied in the passage. This also goes away. This is the answer to the question is option B. And this is from XAT 2011. This is from XAT 2011. So these are the sort of questions that have come in exams, and you should be familiar in this setup. Hopefully, you are familiar and comfortable with these three thinking ideas. Okay. Now, next question. Hopefully, reading the question itself, you can understand where this question is coming from. Impressions are direct, vivid, and forceful products of immediate experience. Ideas are merely feeble copies of these original impressions. Okay? Impression is what you experience when you are interacting with some material, some person, some entity in the world. Ideas are feeble copies of the memory that you have of your original impressions. Assuming the above statement to be true, which statements logically follow from? Every impression leads to an idea. This is not valid. Every impression will necessarily lead to an idea. Is not really implied. This is far too categorical in nature. So let's say while walking on the road, I saw a dog walking. Does that necessarily lead to an idea? Do I think about it? Do I process it in some way? Do I analyze that information? Not really. I see thousands of people every day while walking on the road. All of that, doing all of them are impressions. But does that necessarily lead to an idea? Not really. So this is not logically following. This is not logically following. I can rule out these two options. Once I rule out these two options, see funnily where I reached. Statement 2 is definitely true. Now we have to see if 3 or 4, one of 3 or 4 becomes acceptable or unacceptable. Okay, checking statement 3. Checking statement 3. The color of XAT 2011 test booklet right in front of a candidate is an impression to her, whereas the memory of the color of her television set is an idea. Absolutely. Right now, we are engaging with the test booklet in front of us, so this is an impression, whereas the memory of the color of my television set is something that I'm recalling. This is a feeble copy of the original impression. This is very, very valid, which means at this time, I can rule out option C. 3 has to be a part of my answer. This is valid and this is valid. While statement 2 says ideas must follow an antecedent impression. What it means is first there has to be an impression and then idea comes after it. This is absolutely true according to the given statement. Next, fourth statement. If one was interested in the origin of the idea of the color of a television set, origin of the idea of the color of a television set, then one needs to understand the impressions from which the idea was derived. We know that ideas are feeble copies of the original impressions. So if I want to understand the origin of the idea, I need to understand the impression from which the idea was derived. This is indeed valid. Therefore, the answer to this question will be option D. As indicated or hinted by the question itself, this is from XAT 2011. Next question and last question that I will be solving. After this, there are 5 questions that you are expected to practice by yourself. Okay. Recent studies which involved observing two groups of dogs over a period of 6 months have concluded that a prolonged exposure to the hunting of game animals can cause dogs to develop violent and aggressive behaviors. The scientists observed two different groups of dogs. The dogs in the first group were made to participate in hunting expeditions for more than 30 hours a week, whereas the dogs in the second group were sent to an animal shelter where a veterinarian ensured that they were exposed to a peaceful life. Scientists who noticed that a significantly greater proportion of dogs in the first group eventually exhibited aggressive behavior, reason that the prolonged exposure to violent activities caused the aggression in these dogs. Okay. Which of the following must be known in order to evaluate the scientist's assertion presented above? So, which of the following needs to be known in order to evaluate scientist's assertion presented above? Basically, the answer to the question, we are looking for an option. The answer to the question will help us decide whether the scientist's assertion above is accurate or inaccurate. We are not looking to strengthen the scientist's assertion. We are not looking to weaken the scientist's assertion. We are looking for the answer to a question the answer to which will either strengthen it or weaken the assertion made by the scientist. Okay. Whether at least some of the dogs from the first group were peaceful. The assertion from the scientist was prolonged exposure to hunting makes you more aggressive. Even if, let's say, there are 30 dogs in both the groups, and 2 dogs from the first group turned out to be passive, turned out to be peaceful. They were not very aggressive. Does that in any way impact the assertion made by the scientist? Not really, because if 28 of the dogs are turning aggressive, and let's say in the second group there were only 10 dogs that were turning aggressive, their assertion that prolonged exposure to violent activities causes aggression in dogs would still be valid. So the question posed by A does not really strengthen or weaken the scientist's assertion. It is simply a tangent to the main idea of inquiry. Next, whether some of the dogs in either group were either dropped from the study or moved into the other group midway through the study. Okay, this can perhaps impact the results because let's say there were some aggressive dogs in the second group, and midway through the study, they were sent over to the first group. And then we are making the statement C, the first group has more aggressive behavior. So between A and B, I'd say B survives. Between A and B, B survives. Okay. As in B, if there had been exchange of dogs between the two groups, if there had been exchange of dogs between the two groups, it would weaken the assertion made by the scientist. If there had not been an exchange, it will not strengthen, but at least it will not damage. So between A and B, B is surviving. Between B and C, whether any of the dogs from the second group developed aggressive behavior. Again, this is very much like A. Even if, let's say, 10 out of 30 dogs in the second group developed aggressive behavior, that does not impact the assertion made by the scientists. Scientists who notice a significantly greater proportion of dogs in the first group eventually exhibited aggressive behavior. So if 10 dogs from the second group became aggressive and 28 dogs from the first group became aggressive, their assertion stands. So it does not really strengthen or weaken the scientist's assertion at all. This does not stay. D stays. Option D. Whether the dogs in the first group exhibited aggressive tendencies before the study began. This is an excellent question. Because see, what would happen? If the dogs in the first group already exhibited aggressive tendencies, then the result provided by the experiment is not to be relied upon. Essentially, if I take a very tall person and I take a very short person and I get them to engage in a basketball, let's say 30-day camp, and at the end of the day, the short person turns out to be more proficient at basketball than the tall person. Can I go on to make short people are better at basketball than tall people without revealing the data? So these short people were anyway part of the school teams and college teams and let's say national teams and all of that. But the tall person has never played sport in their life. They are mightily uncoordinated. Basically, if there was inherent bias, it was not done as blind testing. If there was inherent bias in the formation of the groups, that will weaken the assertion made by the scientists. If the groups had been created randomly, as in the prior level of aggression was almost almost similar for both the groups that were created, that will further strengthen the scientist's assertion. Therefore, because B only can damage the scientist assertion, it cannot really help. D can help and D can damage both. Between the two of them, D survives. And last question, whether the dogs in the second group were made to live alone, unlike those in the first group, which were subject to hunting in groups. Okay. Uh, if the dogs in the second group were made to live alone, unlike those in the first group, which were subject to hunting in groups, this is also uh, let's say comparing apples with oranges. The first group, dogs were hunting in groups. They were together. There was some sort of social interaction happening among the dogs. The second group, if we did not have the dogs in a social group, comparing them is not fine. So that weakens our assertion. If the second group, if in the second group of dogs on which the experiment was conducted, they were indeed kept in a group, then it strengthens the idea that yeah, both the sets of people had identical conditions to live by. Both the sets of dogs had identical conditions to live by. Yet the first group developed aggressive tendencies at a higher rate than the second group. So he is also fine. He is also fine. But now we are down to the fight of between D and E, which one is better. Now see, this is directly impacting the final result. This is questioning the research methodology. This is questioning the experiment methodology. And he is directly questioning. He is directly questioning whether they already had those tendencies for which we are now coming to a conclusion. So between the two of them, while E is also fine as an option, in the absence of D, perhaps E would survive. E would be the better option. But given both these options, the preferred choice has to be D. There is nothing wrong with D, just that D is better. And that is the entirety of this set, and everything is done. Now, let us go through the next set of questions. I will display it and count till 5 in my head. Once that count is done, go on to the next page. Next question now. Next question. Next question now. Next question now. And that is the end. These are the 5 questions available for your practice. Please attempt them and then see the solution. If there is a question that you are unsure of, as in why the answer is different than what you are reckoning, then you can ask in the comment box, and then an explanation for the same will be provided in the comment section. But then we don't want to give away the explanation right away. That kind of robs you of an opportunity of engaging with this exercise yourself. Hopefully you learned something. That will be all for this episode. Give up.